8 months after burying her husband of 41 years, Carol sat in her doctor's office and stared at a number on a lab printout that made no sense. Her fasting blood glucose had climbed by nearly 30 points. She hadn't changed her diet. She was walking more, not less. If anything, she'd lost weight, the kind grief takes from a person without asking permission. And yet somewhere behind her ribs, slightly to the left, an organ roughly the size of her own hand had quietly begun failing at a job it had performed without error for 63 years. This is not a metaphor. It has a mechanism. And the mechanism explains why bereaved spouses, tracked across multiple countries and multiple decades, show a measurable rise in new diagnoses of type 2 diabetes in the months following a death, or MATI, a pattern consistent enough that some researchers now treat the pancreas as a kind of seismograph for unprocessed loss. The organ does not know grief, it only knows chemistry. And for months after a death, the chemistry of a grieving body works against this one organ in ways that show up, quietly, on a printed page. The clearest evidence comes from two directions. The first is Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist at the University of Arizona, who has spent over a decade documenting what grief actually does inside a living body. Not what people report feeling, but what their blood, their saliva, and their brain scans record. Across her studies, bereaved individuals show sustained elevation in cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, for months after a loss, not spikes, but a flattened, chronically raised baseline. That finding is clinically confirmed and has been replicated across cultures, ages, and causes of death. The second direction comes from Harvard. In a widely cited study published in the American Journal of Public Health, researchers Felix Elvert and Nicholas Christakis tracked roughly 370,000 elderly married couples over time. When one spouse died, the surviving partner's overall risk of death rose measurably in the months that followed, what researchers now call the widowhood effect. With the increase weighted toward causes consistent with sustained physiological stress, including cardiovascular and metabolic strain. That a grieving body produces more cortisol is settled science. That this cortisol contributes, in a meaningful number of cases, to the gap between a death certificate and a new metabolic diagnosis is mechanistically plausible. And the population-level pattern is difficult to explain any other way. To understand why, you need to understand what the pancreas was built to do and what cortisol does to undo it. The pancreas is, structurally, two organs wearing one shape. About 98% of its tissue is exocrine, clusters of cells called acini, packed like grapes around microscopic ducts, manufacturing digestive enzymes. Trypsin, lipase, amylase, powerful enough to dissolve protein, fat, and starch on contact. These enzymes are so corrosive that the pancreas manufactures them in an inactive form called zymogens and wraps them in a chemical safety lock called a trypsin inhibitor. The lock only releases once the enzymes have left the organ and entered the small intestine. If that lock fails, if the enzymes activate while still inside the pancreas, the organ begins digesting itself. Surgeons have a clinical name for this: autodigestion. It is one of the few organs in your body capable of eating its own tissue, and the only thing standing between normal digestion and that catastrophe is a single inactive chemical bond, working correctly, every minute of every day. Physicians have a nickname for the pancreas, and it is not affectionate: the silent organ. The name comes from anatomy, not metaphor. The pancreas sits deep in the abdomen, behind the stomach, wrapped loosely by the peritoneum, and it carries a comparatively low density of pain-sensing nerve fibers relative to organs positioned closer to the body's surface. Damage that would make a more superficial organ announce itself immediately can progress in the pancreas for months with almost no localized warning. This is precisely why cortisol-driven strain on the islets produces no sensation at all. There is no ache to flag it, no tenderness to investigate. The only evidence arrives later indirectly, on a lab printout. A number that has been changing quietly for longer than anyone suspected. That 98% the exocrine tissue, is also where grief leaves its first, most ordinary fingerprint, days before any blood test would show a thing. Acute grief triggers a sharp rise in sympathetic nervous system activity, the branch of your nervous system responsible for redirecting resources away from digestion and toward vigilance. Sympathetic activation suppresses vagal tone, the signal carried by the vagus nerve that normally tells the pancreas to release its digestive enzymes on schedule. With vagal tone suppressed, enzyme secretion drops, gastric emptying slows, and appetite falls. This is the actual mechanism behind something almost every bereaved person reports and almost no one explains: food losing its pull in the first weeks after a death. It is not sadness alone, in the abstract. It is a nerve, quieted, telling an organ to wait. The other 2% of the pancreas is where the rest of this story lives. Scattered through the organ like islands in a sea of digestive tissue are clusters of cells discovered in 1869 by a German pathology student named Paul Langerhans, who saw them under a microscope and had no idea what they did. We now call them the islets of Langerhans. And inside each islet are at least 2 cell types running an opposing pair of dials alpha cells secrete glucagon, which tells the liver to release stored sugar when blood glucose runs low. Beta cells secrete insulin, which tells the rest of the body, muscle, fat, liver, to open its doors and pull sugar out of the bloodstream when it runs high. Together, alpha and beta cells hold your blood glucose inside an extremely narrow range, checking it and correcting it roughly every few minutes, for your entire life, without you ever noticing the work being done. That balancing act, or kapikwoskimonet, sugar rising, insulin answering, sugar falling, glucagon answering, atinoinamti, is the same kind of feedback loop I keep coming back to on this channel, because grief runs on feedback loops too, just slower and less visible than blood sugar. I've spent months building something I'm calling What Feynman Knew About Grief, a companion resource that walks through exactly these systems, the ones nobody explained to you when you needed them. The link is in the pinned comment below. Stay with me, because the harder part is still ahead. What happens when the system meant to correct a sugar spike is forced, day after day, to correct for something it was never built to handle? Here is what it was never built to handle. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, and each button is your body's ancient alarm system. It evolved to handle physical threat, a predator, a famine, a wound. When the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, registers danger, it signals the hypothalamus, which signals the pituitary gland, which signals the adrenal cortex to release cortisol into the bloodstream. This circuitry does not distinguish between a tiger and a phone call that changes your life. Grief activates the exact same axis, at the exact same intensity, sustained for months instead of minutes. Once cortisol is circulating at elevated levels, it does 2 things to the glucose system, and both work against the pancreas. First, it travels to the liver and stimulates gluconeogenesis, literally, the making of new sugar, instructing liver cells to manufacture glucose out of amino acids and release it into the blood, even though nothing was eaten. Second, it travels to muscle and fat cells and interferes directly with insulin's signaling pathway, blocking a transporter called GLUT4 from moving to the cell surface. GLUT4 is the loading dock, the literal door through which glucose enters a muscle cell once insulin gives the signal. Cortisol keeps that door from opening fully. The result is a body simultaneously producing more sugar and accepting less of it. Blood glucose climbs on both ends at once. The pancreas, sensing the rise through glucose receptors on its own beta cells, does the only thing it knows how to do. It produces more insulin. This is called compensatory hyperinsulinemia, and for a while it works. The beta cells essentially shout louder to be heard over the cortisol. But beta cells are not infinite. Each one is a finite cellular factory, and sustained overproduction, month after month, produces a buildup of unfolded proteins inside the cell, a state researchers call endoplasmic reticulum stress. Some beta cells, pushed past their working capacity for long enough, stop responding. A smaller number die. The islet, as a structure, loses some of its functional mass. And once enough of that mass is gone, no amount of additional cortisol-driven demand can be met. There is a second pressure working alongside the first. Cortisol also signals fat tissue to release stored fat back into the bloodstream as free fatty acids, fuel meant to be burned during a physical emergency that, in grief, never actually arrives. Those circulating fatty acids accumulate around the beta cells themselves, a condition researchers call lipotoxicity, and they interfere with the very same insulin-secreting machinery. Cortisol is already overworking, glucose pressure from one direction, fat pressure from another, converging on a single population of cells the size of a few grains of sand inside an organ most people cannot locate on their own body. Blood glucose stays elevated. Hemoglobin A, 1C, a marker that reflects average blood sugar over roughly the previous 3 months, begins to climb. Past a certain threshold, a doctor writes a new diagnosis on a chart. In a person who, 8 months earlier, had perfectly normal blood work, that climbing number on a lab report is grief, translated into chemistry a doctor can measure. If you want the rest of that translation laid out clearly, what Feynman knew about grief connects everything we're covering today. The link is in the pinned comment. The Harvard widowhood data becomes easier to read once you see the chemistry behind it. Elvert and Christakis weren't measuring sadness. They were measuring death certificates, and the elevated mortality they documented was concentrated most heavily in the first months after the loss. The same window in which cortisol elevation is typically at its highest and most sustained. The widowhood effect, as researchers call it, is not one phenomenon. It is several organ systems absorbing the same chemical signal at the same time, and the pancreas is simply the one that leaves a number behind on paper. Which raises a question that has nothing to do with diabetes and everything to do with what grief actually is. Why would a system built over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, designed to handle famine, predators, physical injury, treat the death of someone you loved as belonging to that same category of emergency? You were not in physical danger. No predator was present, and yet your hypothalamus did not know the difference. There is a diagnostic line buried in all of this that almost no one in grief is warned about. A hemoglobin reading below 5 7/10% is considered normal. Between 5 7/10 and 6 4/10%, a person is classified as pre-diabetic, a category most physicians describe to patients as reversible, manageable, not yet serious. Above 6.5%, the classification changes to type 2 diabetes. The distance between those two categories, in absolute terms, is small, a few tenths of a percentage point, and the data on bereavement suggests that for some recently widowed people, sustained cortisol elevation alone is enough to move them across that line within a single year, not because anything new was wrong with their pancreas, but because the demand placed on it never had a chance to fall back down. That confusion, the body answering an emotional wound with a survival threat response, is the companion guide's starting point. The full breakdown is in the pinned comment below, only while this video is up. The honest answer is that your HPA axis was never built to distinguish between categories of loss. It was built before language, before relationships had names, before grief had a word. It only knows one thing: something in your environment that you depended on for survival is gone, and the body should prepare for scarcity. For most of human history, losing your spouse meant losing a hunting partner, a second set of hands, a source of warmth at night, a person whose survival was tied to yours in concrete, caloric terms. The body's alarm system is not wrong that a profound resource has disappeared. It is only outdated about what kind of resource we are, in fact, grieving. It treats the absence of love the same way it would treat the absence of food, because for nearly all of human history, those two things were never fully separable. This is why the pancreas, an organ with no capacity for memory, no concept of a person, no awareness that anyone has died, still changes shape chemically in response to a death. It cannot grieve. It can only receive the signal that something has gone wrong and respond the only way it knows how, by working harder, for longer, until something in the system gives. The lab result on Carol's printout was not a coincidence, and it was not a separate illness arriving at a cruel time. It was the most literal kind of evidence that the marriage had mattered, written not in a eulogy, but in a hemoglobin value, measured in a blood draw, interpreted by a doctor who had no idea he was reading a record of love. There is something almost unbearably precise about that. A wedding ring can be removed, a side of the bed can stay empty or be filled again, a name can be avoided in conversation for years, but a beta cell does not negotiate, and it does not forget on a schedule that suits anyone. It keeps responding to a chemical signal until the signal itself changes, regardless of what the rest of the household has decided to call moving forward. The body, in this narrow and specific sense, is more honest than language. It does not pretend the loss is smaller than it was. The pancreas does not know who you lost. It only knows that your chemistry changed, and it has been quietly working every day since. To correct math that was never going to balance on its own, that number on a printout is not the end of the story. It's the body's footnote to it. Before this video ends, thank you. YouTube removed our monetization and kept running ads on our content anyway, collecting revenue while we receive nothing. So we created what Feynman knew about grief to keep this information reaching people, without depending on a system that's actively working against us. If this mattered to you, the link is in the description and pinned comment. Only available while this video is running. Just as the pancreas keeps working long after the eulogy is over, asking nothing in return. This channel keeps working too,